Hey everyone, and welcome to the May Lee Show. I'm May Lee, your host. I'm so glad you could join either by podcast or by video on our YouTube channel. Happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. It's the month of May. So this entire month, we dedicate to the celebration of Asian American heritage, all our contributions and all of our stories. So I wanted to use this episode as a chance to talk about this community in a very specific way, which is to focus on this documentary that's about to come out on PBS called Asian Americans. It's a 5-hour documentary in 5 parts, and they're airing it over 2 nights on all PBS stations. So please make a note of that. It's called Asian Americans on May 11th and 12th. And this series really chronicles the history of Asian Americans from the very start of when the Chinese came to build the railroad, and throughout history, the contributions that Asians made to this country, but also the persecution. So this talks about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Asian American experience in all areas, in all aspects. So this is a way that people can really become much more informed about our community, our varied cultures, the diversity of the Asian American experience. And the reason I'm mentioning this series, not just because I think it's going to be great and we should all watch it, but also because I'm going to be talking to the series producer, Renee Tajima-Pena, who is an Academy Award nominee for her film Who Killed Vincent Chin, the murder of Vincent Chin. And so she was nominated for that film, but she's always used her filmmaking abilities, her storytelling abilities as a tool to really inform and educate on issues that maybe people aren't aware of. And she makes them into intricate, interesting stories that we all care about. Especially once you see her films. So she's going to be joining me in a second to talk about this series, Asian Americans. But first, let me roll a clip, a trailer of the series, so you can take a listen or a look, and then we'll come back to talk to Renee.
I'm here today, so the rest of this world hears our story. For 4.5 years, my family was incarcerated. The government framed it as an issue of loyalty.
Many people lose everything.
The Asian voices were so inspirational.
They had to assert their rights.
The railroad could not have been built without the Chinese.
We fought on the side of the United States.
There was a shift in political power.
Asian Americans were free to do anything they wanted.
All hell broke loose.
The city burned.
They were trying to build a life for themselves.
I grew up with the American dream.
You've got young people fighting to make change happen. If a lot of people put their mind to it, they can win.
It was an incredible time.
And their legacy belongs to all of us.
This is our story.
Okay, well, I think we're going to join Renee now at home, of course, because that's where we all are. Hey, Renee, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Hi, May.
So let's first talk about how this series, Asian Americans, started, the whole concept. When did you first come up with this idea, and how long did it take you guys to make it?
You know, it's something that many of us have wanted to do for actually decades.
Wow.
At over 20 years ago, I wrote a treatment for a series on Asian American history.
Oh, my gosh.
We've tried over the years, and nothing ever was greenlit. And then about 2013, I think it was, Jeff Bieber from WIDA, which is the flagship PBS station. They do all the Ken Burns histories. He approached me and Don Young from the Center for Asian American Media and said, hey, do you want to do Asian Americans? Because he had just done Latino Americans and Jewish Americans. And we said, well, yeah, we've been waiting to do it for many years. So we all just decided to collaborate.
Wow. 20 years you came up with this idea. So it took that long.
Yeah, it's, I've wanted to do a series. There are a couple of other producers who tried to get one off the ground, Asian American producers.
Okay.
And we can just never do it. But, the time is right. in the past few years.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree, Renee. And in some ways, whenever I talk about Asian American issues, I always sort of preface it with, well, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, maybe people wouldn't have been ready to hear about these issues or to watch a movie that had an all-star, all Asian cast. So timing is everything, of course. But it is a little surprising that it took that long. But so now it's out.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
We didn't start production until 2018.
Okay.
So we were in production about a year and a half, which is pretty fast for 5 hours.
You know what? That is pretty fast. I'm surprised by that too, because you get a lot of archival video and photos and stories. So we're going to get into, sort of the specifics of the series. But so it's 5 hours, 2 parts, right? And it's going to air.
So the first night will be episodes 1 and 2.
Okay.
And the next 3 episodes will be on the second night.
Oh, so it's 2 nights, but it's 5 parts.
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So what, there's so many questions I want to ask you about this, but what for you, the experience of going through history, because you also teach Asian American studies at UCLA, so you're very familiar with it, but did anything surprise you while you were making this? Any stories or any sort of revelations for you yourself that you're like, whoa, I had no idea?
Oh, a lot of it surprised me.
Yeah.
All of us have been making films about the Asian American experience.
Yep.
And 2 things shocked us. One is that it seemed like deja vu because so many of the themes and so much of the history was being repeated today, like, immigration and deportations. I mean, one thing that surprised me is Asian Americans were actually the first undocumented immigrants. Now, I knew about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first time a whole group of people were banned from entry to the country based on race. Right. But I never put 2 and 2 together that really made Asian Americans undocumented immigrants in the way we think about that term today. But that's something that Erica Lee, who's a historian, when she said that, I thought, oh, my God. So it's just kind of another way of thinking and framing that history in a way that ties so clearly to today.
Right.
Also, the South Asian American history, which goes back to the 1800s. People think about Indians and Pakistanis and, South Asians as being sort of a very new immigrant group. But their history dates back to, over 100 years. And their immigration pattern and story was so similar to other Asian American groups.
Yeah.
So that was really a surprise.
Renee, you talked about the timing of the series coming out now. And even though you thought of this 20 years ago, and that's loaded right now, isn't it, in terms of the timing? Because who would have expected that this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, would then result in the most anti-Asian sentiment since 1980s, since Vincent Chin, right? I mean, it really, this is a moment that our community has not experienced in a very long time. So how has this affected, I guess, the release of the series in some ways and the way people are viewing it and the importance, even more important now that this series comes out, right? In many ways.
Right. Well, the scheduling has been on board since last year sometime.
Yeah.
I think last summer. So the scheduling isn't any different. It's just the timing of what happened with the COVID crisis and this kind of backlash and, the president calling it the Chinese virus. And people picking up on it, calling it Kung Flu. And I mean, it's been, the whole community's been battered. But an interesting thing is, as we were going through the production and looking at this history, we were really following these fault lines of race and immigration and inequality that have been there since we started to arrive in this country.
Yeah.
And during times of crisis, the fault lines erupt,
right.
Earthquake. So in the case of Vincent Chin's murder, during that time, Japanese auto imports were being blamed for the recession in Detroit.
Yep.
Because, the Japanese were making fuel efficient cars. That's what American consumers wanted to buy. And the American auto industry just,
it was tanking. They were doing poorly. Right.
But so all the hatred was directed towards Japanese. It was scapegoating. People can't tell the difference. You're Chinese, Japanese, Korean, whatever.
Right.
And so Vincent Chin was killed by 2 auto workers.
Right.
And the interesting thing in the series, in his interview, that Viet Thanh Nguyen, the novelist, said was, when that case happened for Asian Americans, it wasn't shocking because it was something new, because it was something old. It's something we had seen before, decades back to the whole 150 years that we look at in the series. And so that's what was so important to us in making the series. And we were making it during, relatively good times.
Right.
Prosperity, it was kind of peaceful on the home front. But we knew that if there's another crisis, and, there's been this kind of simmering conflict with China that's growing. So we knew something was going to blow.
Right.
And it actually happens quite often. I mean, you talked about, you've got a little tail wagging.
I know. That's okay, as long as she doesn't bark. She's done this before.
I love that, actually.
I know.
Dogs are more obedient than little kids. I've been on.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway.
So it's actually happened quite often. 9/11, again, South Asians, Muslims were being scapegoated for, Sikhs who are a completely different religion because they wear turbans. People accuse them of being Osama bin Laden.
Yep.
And, there was a gas station attendant in Arizona who was murdered by somebody who was scapegoating him.
I remember
as
that.
being Muslim and
Yeah.
The Wen Ho Lee case, Wen Ho Lee was framed as being a spy for China. This was in the 1990s. So, and the targeting of Chinese academics and Chinese scientists in this country has been ongoing.
Which is getting worse now, right? I mean, they're really enacting some strict regulations to either send them home or not allow them to come, even students, right? So, look, this is a series of events throughout history that have been taking place. And so this is nothing new, like you're saying. However, what I find so interesting and a little disappointing, to be totally frank, is the lack of awareness that these things have been happening and these historical events have taken place. But people, mainstream certainly, but even within the Asian community, there's a lot of lack of awareness that this has been happening, that this has been the part of the Asian American experience. So something like this series, hopefully people will be educated and informed. But do you get frustrated too, like I do, that there is this, it seems like Asian American history is just not important enough for people to care about?
Oh, sure. Where are you going to learn about Asian American history?
Yeah.
Mostly not in the textbooks.
Right.
I was 40 years ago when I was a student at Harvard. We were demanding and, sitting in for Asian American studies and ethnic studies. 40 years later, still doesn't happen,
Yeah.
So, and that's all over the place, but there are bright spots. I mean, I teach in Asian American studies at UCLA. We've just hired a lot of new faculty. I mean, it's a growing department.
Okay, that's good.
What worries me, I think, is because of this crisis, we're going into a deep recession. I just saw that at Ohio, the University of Ohio, I think, or Ohio State, they're making budget cuts. The first cuts they made was African American studies. So I think ethnic studies could be on the chopping block.
Yeah.
Even before we were able to really get up speed across the country. But, this country is changing. It's becoming much more diverse.
Yes.
You can't ignore us anymore. And
no, I mean, come on, Renee. I mean, I say this all the time, and I'm sure you do too, that we are the fastest growing ethnic minority in the country, fastest growing voting bloc, which is pretty dang important, right? The influence is growing, and yet there's still this slow progress in terms of the recognition and the representation. And especially now because of COVID, my fear is that, like you're saying, we're going to take a huge step backwards in many ways. And it's funny when you talk about things like the model minority, right? And that's something that is a myth, that has really kind of screwed up, I think, the Asian American community. It's like we're the model minority until we're not. And right now we're not. We're the enemy again, right?
Well, what the series really does is, we debunk the model minority myth in a lot of ways. And one of the ways we do is we look at the way Asian Americans have fought back throughout this time. And that's why the Asian American story is an American story. If you go way back in history to Wong Kim Ark in the late 1800s, he was U.S. born, a citizen. He was a Chinese restaurant worker in San Francisco. And when he was denied re-entry to the United States because he was Chinese, even though he was Chinese American, he didn't take it sitting down. He went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's why there's birthright citizenship. So if you're born here, even if you're born to immigrants, even if you're born to undocumented immigrants, you are a U.S. citizen. And that's why my parents became citizens. That's why, many kids today, many babies born today, this right as we speak, are U.S. citizens because of Wong Kim Ark. So that's an American story.
Yeah, but not a story that's that well known. You ask the average person, they would have no idea that that's why we have these rights.
No. Civil liberties, the Japanese American fight for civil liberties, that the bill that was signed by, Ronald Reagan, of all presidents, in 1988, protected the rights of all Americans, not just Japanese Americans. So you go down the line, and Asian Americans really have been at the center of these stories. And they're like the story of, we interviewed Connie Young Yu, whose great-grandfather was a Chinese railroad worker who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. Wow. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad was, the engine of the move west, which, I can argue with that. They seized Native American land. It was, a brutal and kind of violent move, but it did connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. It was like part of it was one of the drivers of the modern era of America.
Right.
And on the western leg of the Transcontinental Railroad, the vast majority of the workers who built that were Chinese immigrant railroad workers.
Yep.
Connie's story is really interesting because her great-grandfather helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad. His son did pretty well. You can call him a so-called model minority. He had a business in San Francisco's Chinatown.
Okay.
But when he died suddenly when he was pretty young, and when his wife tried to return from a visit to China, she was an immigrant. She wasn't born here. She was denied reentry. They told her, well, you're a widow. Your husband's dead, so you no longer have any status here in the United States. She was kept on Angel Island at the immigration station where all Asian immigrants pass through for interrogation.
Was San Francisco.
San Francisco in the San Francisco Bay.
Yep.
And she was with her children who are all U.S. born. So Connie's grandmother was stopped at the Angel Island immigration station and detained there for 15 and a half months. And here she had all these young kids who were separated from her during that whole time. 15 and a half months. It's just, blew my mind to hear that story.
One of the harshest punishments is to separate parents from their children. It's a detention of people who are struggling to survive.
Connie's grandmother spends over a year at Angel Island before she's finally able to reunite with her American-born children.
So, when we hear these stories, it seems like history continues to repeat itself, right? And we just don't learn. That, personally, I have to say, I get very frustrated and disappointed because I want humanity to progress. But when it comes to especially the treatment of minorities and people of color, it seems as if we take 2 steps forward, maybe 1 step back, sometimes 3 steps back. What do you see in all of this that we're going through today? Again, looking back at history, that gives you some hope or something that you see that's different this time around that might push us forward. Maybe this is finally the moment that changes things for our community.
Well, history repeats itself in more than one way. So if you look at the Vincent Chin case, I mean, it was a real terrible injustice what happened to Vincent Chin. His killers never served a day in jail. Yet it spawned this incredible national movement and campaign for justice.
Right.
And so many people were inspired by it. These Asian American legal defense organizations really grew after that, and Asian Americans fought back. If you go back to World War II, when Japanese Americans were incarcerated in concentration camps, my family was incarcerated as well. So that was a terrible injustice. Yet, Japanese Americans, Asian Americans have fought back not only in the redress and reparations movement that led to the 1988 Civil Liberties Act, but today, Japanese Americans, go to the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, and protest the detention of families, immigrant families from beyond the southern border. So that's so important.
Yeah.
Japanese Americans, I know, after 9/11, when we knew that South Asians, Muslims, and Arab Americans were going to be targeted, like within days, there were vigils all over the country with people locking arms with those groups, with South Asians and Muslims and Arab Americans, and demanding, no racial profiling. The same thing that happened to Japanese Americans cannot happen to another group of Americans.
Right.
So that fight gives me hope. And a lot of young people really have that fight.
Yeah. Yeah. It is that idea of solidarity, isn't it? That it's not just each group. We all have this fight to fight. We've all gone through a similar experience. And so if we don't come together and bring our forces together and have that empathy and compassion and understanding to therefore bring, our powers together, then it can't be this separate fight constantly. It has to be, there has to be some unity there.
And not only among Asian Americans, but with other Americans.
Exactly.
I mean, right now, if you look at the COVID crises, Asian Americans are really taking it because of the anti-Asian hate.
Yeah.
Because of this whole China virus idea. But if you look at other communities of color, including Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, they're being hammered by the health disparities, by health inequalities. That's really our fight too. And what we found is that solidarity has been there, over time. I mean, there's one of our characters is Patsy Mink, who was the first woman of color elected to Congress. And we found this amazing piece of footage of her at 60 years ago at another election year at the Democratic National Convention here in Los Angeles. And she was giving a speech that really convinced the delegates to stay firm on the civil rights point. So she championed civil rights, way back in the 1950s and 1960s.
Right.
And people don't really realize that Asian Americans have, marched alongside other groups of Americans since we came to this country.
Right. But we have to continue to do so. That's the thing. It's just because one group advances, you shouldn't think that you're not part of the continued movement forward for all minority groups, to be able to advance together.
Well, it's the same fault lines of racism and xenophobia and inequality. It's the same fault lines. So unless we go to the roots and attack the roots, I mean, I always think about it like, if you have a tumor in your stomach or something like that, you have a tumor in your lungs, and you can't just attack the tumor in your stomach, right? And ignore the lungs.
Right.
So it's like, for Asian Americans, we can't just look at ourselves and ignore, the rest of the cancer.
Right.
We have to attack the cancer.
Right. We have to attack the cause, the root of the cause. Well, though that's also the problem that seems to be so pervasive, right? How do we attack that cause? How do we get rid of that ultimate cause? And that's something that, like, when events like this happen, you realize, oh man, racism has always been here. It will always be here. It's always an underlying theme. And that I think that's what frustrates people so much, is that, there are moments of peace, but then, like you're saying, the fault line, boom, and, all bets are off. So again, how do we, I want to find solutions. I think we all do. How do we move forward? How do we not take this moment and then dismiss it once it goes away, saying, okay, we're back to normal? What is it going to take for us to really, change as a society in attitude and behavior? Maybe it's leadership too. Oh, let's be real, right? Yeah.
Leadership comes from different places.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to come from the White House.
Yes,
of course. From the White House. But I think that's why the history is important, because things have gotten a lot better.
Yeah.
100 years ago, or not even 100 years ago, until the 1960s, there were anti-miscegenation laws. In different states, even if you were Asian, you couldn't intermarry. You couldn't marry a white person.
Right.
Things have really moved, and they've moved because people have organized. I think there are two things. I'm a storyteller. I'm a filmmaker. So it's changing the narrative.
Yes.
Changing the narrative. There has been solidarity. There has been this fight. The idea that Asian Americans are a model minority, that we just kind of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we're quiet and compliant, that's a narrative.
Yes.
That's a false narrative. The other narrative is no, Asian Americans, when there's been injustice, like Wong Kim Ark, they've gone to the courts. They've gone to the ballot box, like Patsy Mink. She was elected to Congress and fought in Congress. They've gone to the streets. We have one episode that follows the San Francisco State strike. It's Asian American students with African American, Latino, white students, all demanding ethnic studies at San Francisco State College, and they won. They won the first college of ethnic studies. It's still there. And that's how people learn this history. They learn it through colleges of ethnic studies, through classes of ethnic studies.
Right.
So one thing is changing the narrative. The second thing, and you see it, all through history, we documented in the series, is people organizing, coming together and organizing.
Right.
And it's not only marching, but, it's changing legislation. It's making demands and changing policy. It's educating people. And that's been happening, actually. It's happening in a lot of places. There's an infrastructure. I just think that we have to, on steroids.
Yeah.
Now, we really have to attack it.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing, during this whole COVID crisis, I haven't seen Asian Americans as galvanized and mobilized as, in years. People immediately started to respond. They started to go to the press. They're collecting data, which is so important.
Yeah.
You need data to make policy and to find solutions. They can't go out and march to protest, but they're protesting in other ways.
Social media.
Heard.
That's the beauty of social media. Yeah.
The Wash the Hate campaign is one thing. It's been remarkable. Even the response, if you remember the Andrew Yang Washington Post.
Yes, I spoke about that on one of my shows. Yeah.
So when he suggested, well, you should basically wear red, white, and blue, prove you're American, to counter the people, reacted really fiercely and really fast and said, no, that's not the way we make change. For one thing, we've been contributing forever. And
in many ways, in all industries and all areas. Yes.
The service, as well as making like really change to the roots of inequality.
Right.
But, that was, in that case, I mean, it's very interesting that Asian Americans were so, outspoken.
Yeah, I think, we definitely are reaching a place where we become much more emboldened, courageous with our voices, willing to use our voices and elevate our voices so that they are really heard this time and not ignored. I think finally our community is willing to really break out of that dumb ass stereotype that has existed for, centuries. And it's showing. It's finally showing. And I think a crisis like this clearly is catapulting that cause even further and faster at an exponential rate, which that could be the silver lining, right? This is the moment that is galvanizing us as a community and unveiling to all of us, wow, there's some serious issues that we need to address. We cannot ignore.
It's a tipping point.
Yes.
And if you look back on history, as we did, at all those tipping points, Asian Americans have moved things forward. It's that, what did Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we've seen over time. But justice doesn't just happen.
Right.
You've got to make it happen.
You got to fight for it. You got to fight for it and be heard, or else, I've been saying on my show to my audience, who is mostly Asian American, and I say, you have to fight the fight. We have to fight the fight. Nobody's going to do it for us. Why would anybody outside our community do it for us? We have to do it. And then that informs the broader community that there is an issue, that there is this issue that everyone should care about.
Yes. I mean, I mostly believe that, but actually people have fought for us.
That's true. That is true. But it was also because the issue was something that, was rooted in our community. And so therefore there was an awareness there.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think people don't realize how the fight has really been happening. If you look at culture right now, it's great. You've got I think the biggest shows on Netflix are Mindy Kaling's television or episodic television. Yeah. And Alice Wu's new feature. I mean, those are the biggest on Netflix. You have the Crazy Rich Asians and the Farewell, and you have this great explosion of Asian American screen images and culture. Right. But if you look back in time, you see like Setsu Hayakawa in the early 1900s and Anna May Wong, who they really fought against stereotypes. Yeah. Hard for them. I mean, they were really alone, but they fought against stereotypes. Bruce Lee, people see him as, this martial arts kind of fighter, but Bruce Lee actually really resisted this idea that he's the sidekick and that Asians are always cast as sidekicks or cast in these ridiculous kinds of roles. Right. And he really wants to take control. So all through the whole history of cinema, and Asian Americans go back into, the beginning of the silent era. I mean, Marion Wong, who Arthur Dong, who's a filmmaker and curator, kind of rediscovered. This was a Chinese American, student and waitress in Oakland in the early 1900s. And she saw Charlie Chaplin shooting in her neighborhood and said, I can do that. And I think in 1916 or 1917, she was actually the first woman director to produce a feature film. It was like a 7-reeler or something like that. And it was all about Chinese culture.
Wow.
She wanted to show the authentic Chinese heritage. Oh, yeah. It's phenomenal. So all of them were, they saw the way Asians were being depicted at that time, which is, they're depicted as savages, as villains, right? As caricatures. And they said, no, I want to create my own image. I mean, Setsu Hayakawa actually started his own movie studio so that he can make movies that were, much more authentic in terms of Japanese culture. Yeah. Anna May Wong, wanted to do that. She ended up just leaving the United States and going to Europe. But she was outspoken about the roles that she was and Asian actors were forced to portray. And you're talking about, people 100 years ago.
Right.
And fast forward through the ages, and you see Asian American actors, actresses,
directors, writers, producers.
They have fighting this fight within the realm of art and culture.
Right. And like you were saying earlier, Renee, it's all about the narrative and taking control of the narrative and shaping it so that it does truly reflect our culture and our traditions and who we are and the diversity of the Asian culture. Because, we're this is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, right? So this is a time that we can really try to extend that narrative and hopefully have it reach out to a much broader audience so that, information is knowledge is power. Right. And without it, people will continue to perpetuate those stereotypes, and you can't blame some people because if that's all they're exposed to, then what else are they supposed to think unless we start trying to tell more of those stories and putting that information out there like you're doing with this series. So I think it's brilliant what you guys have done with this series. Again, hard work, right? I mean, this was not an easy job.
No, but it's great. We had such a great team. I called it the Asian American Dream Team.
Oh, nice.
Leo Chang, Grace Lee, Gita Gamber. And what's so wonderful is when I first started back in the 80s, it was just, we were demanding a way in. We wanted to sit at the table, but, we were just learning. But now you have Asian American talent. Gita, one of our producers, I think she won 3 national Emmys during the time that we were producing the show. It's just, amazing what they were doing and what they were achieving and what they have accomplished.
Yeah.
So there's no argument now that we used to always get the argument, well, we only pick quality and, you Asian Americans aren't ready yet. Well, we are ready for prime time. We're on prime time.
Oh, honey, we were born ready, right?
Yes.
And Renee, let's not dismiss and forget the fact that you are an Oscar nominee. So please don't, let's not forget about that part. But listen, Renee, it was so wonderful to talk to you, and I so look forward to seeing this whole series. And I really hope that the word gets out that everyone should sit down and watch this very important series. And entertaining too. It's not all just serious. It's about every aspect of the Asian American experience. So
stories.
Yeah, it's and you know what? That's the thing. It's all about stories. We're all human beings. We all have stories to share. And the more stories we hear, the more we learn about each other and the more we realize we're so much alike. We have a lot in common, right? We're part of the human race, and so we should work together, especially at a time, when we're all dealing with the same crisis around the world.
Right. We're not viruses.
Yeah, we're not. We're definitely not viruses. So, well, Renee, good luck with the series, and thank you so much for your time. And hopefully, we will stay in touch. And let me know what else you're up to in the world of filmmaking and storytelling.
Well, thank you, May, for having me on.
All right. Well, take care and stay safe, please.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, so remember, the series Asian Americans airs on May 11th and 12th on all PBS stations. So please put that into your calendar so you can watch it. It's going to be 5 parts over 2 nights, Asian Americans. I think this is really an important time for us to watch this kind of series, to learn about our own histories. And hopefully for people who aren't part of the Asian American community, it doesn't matter. These are things that we need to know about just in terms of the American history lesson, because we are such a melting pot of different cultures, different people, different backgrounds. So storytelling is the most powerful way to inform people and also learn about other people. So try to tune in, guys, May 11th and 12th on your PBS station. Okay, so thanks for tuning in. Again, happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Let's celebrate together and let's keep that narrative going and keep your hope and positivity going, everyone. We're going to get through all of this together. We're going to become more powerful. We will become bigger voices, and hopefully we'll be better people on the other side of all of this craziness. All right. Okay. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.